Herzlich willkommen. Bienvenue, les amis. Hey, it's a wonderful summer evening. I didn't get a chance to play tennis. The courts were all backed up, which is too bad. C'est dommage. But today, I'd like to talk about Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. It's a book. If you didn't notice, this is it. It's about 300 pages, I would say. It's not a long read. This edition, which is a 1950 edition, the book was published in 1927, I believe. 1927. This edition was published in 1950. Yeah, 1927. This edition was published in 1950. I quite like this publication, this book in particular. The one by Alfred A. Knopf. These guys. I like the typeface. The font is quite nice, and the pages feel very good too. Now, Willa Cather was born December 7th, 1876, near Winchester, Virginia, where her father and her ancestors for several generations farmed the land. When she was 8 years old, her father bought a ranch in Nebraska, and the family moved from the tranquil, ordered life of an old Virginia society with its conservative traditions to the wild, free, adventurous scene of the western prairies, then thinly populated with foreign settlers, Norwegians, Swedes, Bohemians, Germans. Here, Willa Cather spent most of her time riding about on her pony, visiting these foreign-born neighbors whose struggles to master the soil in the face of droughts and blizzards, hailstorms and prairie fires, gave its first great awakening to her imagination and deeply colored her later life and work. Some other stuff back here too, but we won't read that. So that really colors her novels well, and it really contextualizes them well. I don't think this is her best known novel. I think it's O Pioneers, which is another story that I believe, I can only assume from the name, is in the similar vein to settlers, early 19th century settlers, and how they are engaging with the prairies. It's really couched in a time period, the 19th century, manifest destiny, all of those ideas which are thorny issues to talk about in American culture now. But everything is becoming a thorny issue. It's odd because I actually, growing up in a quasi-American background, I went to many American schools throughout my childhood, not all of them. High school, I didn't go to many American schools, but I had not heard of Willa Cather until recently, so I decided to read this book from her, Death Comes for the Archbishop. She is quite a big figure in American literary history, though. She won the Pulitzer Prize, I believe, as well. So I feel like a moron for just, well, I shouldn't say a moron, but I feel quite uneducated in regards to American literature for only discovering her recently. But what is Death Comes for the Archbishop? It's about these two Catholic priests. They're based on real life characters and a real life situation. It's these two Catholic priests that are on a mission in the southwest of the United States. So predominantly what today would be known as New Mexico. The priests are, in the book, they're Jean-Marie Latour and Father Joseph Valiant. So, Marie Latour, he is the bishop and Joseph Valiant, Father Joseph, sometimes known as Father Valiant. It gets a bit confusing sometimes in the book because sometimes she will just switch from Father Joseph to Father Valiant, and she'll switch from the Bishop Latour, Father Jean, Marie. It gets a bit complicated, but Father Joseph Valiant, and whenever you see Joseph and Valiant, it's that one guy, and Jean-Marie Latour, he is the Archbishop, the big OG bishop. And it's really about these two characters predominantly. The main one is the bishop, Jean-Marie Latour, and he embodies the educated French Catholic priest. I believe they're Franciscan from like the Franciscan school, but there's another school that they're from. I forget its name exactly. It might be another school, Auvergnat, something like that. But anyway, the bishop, he's a very educated, well polished, and refined type of character, and the father is a bit more of a rough, do-it-yourself type of priest, a kind of earthly priest, and that's the kind of the words are getting out of me. That's the dichotomy between the two. Whatever. That's the relationship between the two. Okay, it's similar to if anyone's read Zorba the Greek. In some ways, not exactly as intense as Zorba the Greek, I would say, but you have this kind of refined, educated character and this more earthly, hands-on character. And they are trying to set up a diocese, a church government, around the Southwest. And it is based on two actual priests that engaged in this mission. There were many missions that took part in this area of the world. There are also characters that are real-life figures that are in this narrative as well. Kit Carson, a frontiersman. He shows up every once in a while in the narrative. There is not really much of an emphasis on plot. It reads like a batch of short stories that are thread together. There are themes throughout here. There is definitely a theme, but it reads like batches of short stories. Often characters are recounting things to the priests, or the priests are recounting something that they remember, or something very interesting happens in their lives. It often reads like a travel book as well. A lot of colorful, decorative, descriptive paysages, rich in color. Willa Cather, I'm really struck by the amount of color, the flora, and the landscape that she writes about. She's quite an intense writer in that regard, I would say. It's almost approaches on Blood Meridian levels of intensity. Not quite as violent as Blood Meridian, but there is definitely a bit of a similarity there. Maybe that's just because they're both set in similar areas of the world. But I must say, I do feel a bit of a connection to Blood Meridian, but maybe I'm just not as well read. Maybe that's just comes with the territory for those types of books. I am well read enough. Screw it. But the theme that threads through this, one of the themes is there is a deep sense of loneliness in the world for these priests when they're engaging in their actions. And this loneliness comes from these three forces that are they seem to be caught within these three forces or these three cultures. And these forces are the old world priests. So these are old world Spanish Franciscan friars who hundreds of years before the events in this book, and this book takes place, although it was written in 1927, takes place roughly throughout from 1850s to the 1880s. So about 30-year period, maybe a bit before, but roughly around that time period. But prior to that, 200 years before that, 250 years before that, Franciscan Spanish monks, friars, came into this area of Mexico, what's now southwestern United States, and they set up communes, and they tried their best to set up dioceses and spread the Catholic faith. And it really led to an isolated society where the Catholic beliefs of the old world, the very intense beliefs, intermingled very often with many of the indigenous beliefs. And the priests in this narrative, Jean-Marie Latour and Father Joseph, they are confronted with these old world bastions, these old world priests who have beliefs and have essentially taken over these communes and are running these communes in a way that is quite antithetical to what the current Catholic beliefs are at the time. So, for example, you would have priests that father incredible amounts of children, that are just open about having children. You would have priests that would treat some of their subjects or the people that they're converting incredibly poorly, almost like slaves. But Willa Cather kind of portrays this with a bit of nuance. It isn't completely like they're the worst types of priests ever. She shows that even these priests, these old world priests that twist much of Catholicism and mix it up with many of the indigenous beliefs, they maintain societies that are well in order and that for the most part function accordingly and properly. But there is a conflict between these old world priests and their beliefs, these old world bastions. Then the second force are the natives. The indigenous people of the Southwest are maintaining their traditions, but in secrecy very often. It's hidden away. There is many parts of this novel that detail the indigenous engagement with the land, the indigenous engagement with ceremony, culture. There's this one scene where they're in a mountain, and it's a really odd scene, but that is another one where characters that are seemingly Catholic and Christianized are still clinging on to old beliefs. So there's that tension too. And then the third tension is the American encroachment, the inevitable effects of Manifest Destiny, which Willa Cather herself lived through and saw essentially after, at least she saw these events as they were being actualized. And in this novel, they're already starting to be shown to take place. The trade routes, the land that is being taken up, that is all in the background. It is all alluded to. And it's these three tensions that lead the priests themselves, or at least Jean-Marie Latour, to live a very isolated and kind of torn existence in this new world. There is a passage that perhaps best exemplifies this. So, this is Jean-Marie Latour, and he's describing the native mountains in France. Clermont. He loved the towering peaks of his native mountains, the comeliness of the villages, the cleanness of the countryside, the beautiful lines and cloisters of his own college. Clermont was beautiful, but he found himself sad there. His heart lay like a stone in his breast. There was too much past, perhaps. When the summer wind stirred, the lilacs in the old gardens shook down the blooms of the horse chestnuts. He sometimes closed his eyes and thought of the high song the wind was singing in the straight, stripped pine trees up in the Navajo forests. During the day his nostalgia wore off, and by dinner time it was quite gone. He enjoyed his dinner and his wine and the company of cultivated men, and usually retired in good spirits, but it was in the early morning that he felt the ache in his breast. It had something to do with waking up in the early morning. It seemed to him that the grey dawn lasted so long here. The country was a long while in coming to life. The gardens and the fields were damp. Heavy mists hung in the valley and obscured the mountains. Hours went by before the sun could disperse those vapors and warm and purify the villages. In New Mexico he always awoke a young man. Not until he rose and began to shave did he realize that he was growing older. His first consciousness was a sense of the light, dry wind blowing in through the windows, with the fragrance of hot sun and sagebrush and sweet clover, a wind that made one's body feel light and one's heart cry, "Today, today," like a child's. Beautiful surroundings, the society of learned men, the charm of noble women, the graces of art could not make up to him for the loss of those light-hearted mornings of the desert, for that wind that made one a boy again. He had noticed that this peculiar quality in the air of new countries vanished after they were tamed by man and made to bear harvests. Parts of Texas and Kansas that he had first known as open range had since been made into rich farming districts, and the air had quite lost that lightness, that dry aromatic odor. The moisture of plowed land, the heaviness of labor and growth and grain bearing utterly destroyed it. One could breathe that only on the bright edges of the world, on the great grass plains, or the sagebrush desert. So, there it is. Industrialization bad. That's it. But this is a good peek into society, I would say, and the lives of two missionaries that were real people. There's not much of a story or a plot that is happening. The little stories themselves are very often good, interesting, and amusing. It's a good book, decent book. Yeah, I can't really say anything too bad about it, other than perhaps if you are looking for a bit more of a plot, this book might not be for you at all. If you are just into characters riding on horseback and going through wagons, going to different areas in the southwestern United States, and talking a bit about faith and all that. There isn't that much spoken about faith actually in this book, which is a point that I'd like to make. While this is about two Catholic priests, Cather doesn't really discuss God that much in this story. It's not really a question. It's not like, don't expect Dostoevsky like does God exist? Type stuff, which fucking ruins many novels, in my opinion. Don't expect that there. It's a much fresher look at these priests that are just engaging with their lives. And overall, enjoyable read. Thanks for watching. Peace out. See you later.